Hi there, welcome everyone. I think we're going to get started. Delighted that you could join us here today. My name is Am Johal. I'm the director of SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Delighted to be partnering with Nightwood Editions, the Jim Green Foundation, to host the launch for Bob Williams' book, Using Power Well. I wanted to begin by recognizing that we're on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. It's a real joy to have Bob with us to share some of the stories in this book. And I had a chance to read the book before it was published, so I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Bob. After Bob speaks for about 15 or 20 minutes, I'll be in a conversation with him briefly, and then we'll take some audience questions as well. And shortly after 8 o'clock, don't go home because we have a reception happening next door in the World Arts Center where Bob will be available to sign books as well. For many of you in this room know Bob. I know you've already been stepping up and speaking with him and getting him to sign your book, but Bob's a former BC cabinet minister who played a key role in establishing the Agricultural Land Reserve and ICBC during BC's first NDP government in the 1970s. More recently, Bob was influential in building the Vancity Credit Union into the leading cooperative financial institution in Western Canada. Bob also has an honorary doctorate. He's also the owner of the Railway Club during its heyday. There's so many stories about Bob, which is why he's affectionately known as the living legend. So please join me in welcoming Bob Williams.
Thanks, Am. It's a pleasure. Oh, of course. Forgive me. Is this sound okay? I don't want to start without recognizing the role that Am plays in this neighborhood and in this community. Way back when Tamara Vrooman was the CEO at Vancity, she asked me to take on a small job. Would I come down and look at the beginnings of Jim Green's work here in Woodwards and think about what Vancity should contribute to this whole exercise? And in those days, they were looking at naming rooms or buildings or whatever. And as I sort of puzzled over this a little bit, I realized that probably what was best was a linkage between the new folks here at SFU and the regular folks that were historically part of this neighborhood. So that's what I ended up taking as my recommendation to Tamara. And she happily agreed to that. And how many years later is this now, Am? Since 11 wonderful years. And it's sort of made such a difference in so many ways. And in my book, I try and reflect a little bit on that at the very end, talking about, meetings that Am had arranged here. I mean, can you imagine a Sunday afternoon meeting down here where you've asked this bit of a nerd to come and talk about economic democracy? Well, who the hell is going to turn out for that on a Sunday afternoon? And the answer is a fair number of people. 60-odd people showed up, and I ended up giving a talk about economic democracy and Vancity and Emilia-Romagna and Bologna and all those experiences there. And then I mention it toward the end of the book, and I talked about this range of experience. And one of the and it was mainly local neighborhood people that came out for these meetings. And one of the women from the hood said, I just wanted to ask you this. And I said, oh, what's that? Do you realize how lucky you've been? And I have to admit, it stopped me dead. The truth is, I had not realized how lucky I was. And you know, for me, life has been an amazing journey. And I really thanked her for that because she'd stopped me dead and forced me to think about what a joyous, valued life I'd had, and as it turns out, such a long life. But at any rate, Am, bless you. You've made one hell of a difference in your community, in this neighborhood, and with so many people around us. So I just wanted to remember that and celebrate it. But I will read one or two pages that were recommended to me by some of my friends. And, but I wanted to just talk about mountains for a while. We don't tend to talk about mountains in this province. And yet, here we are, 95% mountains in British Columbia. And how and why is that? Well, you know, one of my hobby horses is the forest industry in this province because of its terrible inadequacies. And they refer to this territory as fiber. Can you imagine? This magnificent province, like anywhere in the world. And they talk about it as fiber for God's sake. Well, in part of my work with Vancity, I had the opportunity of going to Bologna and Emilia-Romagna and that part of the world, and then spending a bit of a time in the mountains of to the north, and it's where they held the Olympics, 40 years ago or more. But a fascinating area, that northern edge of northern Italy, where it was formerly part of Austria after the First World War, became part of northern Italy. But the Italians always want to have people happy. And these were two kind of earlier nations. And so this mix of the know-how of the Austrians and their abilities and the conviviality of the Italians and their abilities is made for a wonderful region. And as I spent more time there, the summers there are gloriously cool and away from the hotter parts of the country. And I got to know a professor there, Carlo Warzaga, and I said, tell me how all this has happened, you know, this wonderful mix. And then one critical part of it is vertical systems. How many vertical systems do we have in BC? You know, the most active one has been the one just on the edge of Squamish, which has been a phenomenal success despite the cutting of the wires. And when you think about what we might do with vertical systems and with people with the ability of Al Rain and Nancy Green, you start realizing, my God, what might we do? And around Squamish alone in terms of vertical systems. And because what it came to me in that part of northern Italy is that almost every beautiful mountain peak in the Dolomites basically established an economy for the local village. And then you start thinking about BC and what we might do with vertical systems. So Borzaga said, I said, so how is this paid for? And he said, well, the vertical systems here through the whole mountain region, you know, hundreds of miles in each direction actually, it's 60% is paid for by Rome, the state, and the 40% is cooperatively based with small businesses and villages in the region itself. So they've created this wonderful region of the Dolomites, one of the most beautiful mountain regions in the world, and they've done it that way. And so I've since seen Al, and I didn't intend to spend as much time on this other than because of its significance in this province. And a few years ago, and I said, Al, you know, what are the opportunities still around? And he referred to a whole immense possibility in the Coquihalla alone, let alone what we might do in the Kootenays and and in the sort of dry snow areas of the province. And, you know, he originally wanted to do something closer to Lillooet, where there's the dry snow of the interior and so on. And so we've got these tremendous possibilities with our mountains in BC, and yet we provide virtually no creative governance for them. And so that's what I wanted to spend on that one. But there's just a hell of an opportunity in BC with our mountains, because we've tended to forget them. There's so many assets in this province that are so great. But I was going to read from the book a little bit, but I can sketch it out this way. The first thing was about, I was an insider getting a job at City Hall. That was my big job in British Columbia initially. And the truth of it is, my dad was a carpenter, and after I graduated from Britannia, I ended up working for him on a new house in Capilano Highlands, which was the new growth area on the North Shore. At the end of that summer, working there, it was the owner of the house, I didn't know it, happened to be an assistant personnel director at City Hall. And he said, "Well, Bob, what are you going to do now that summer's over?" And I said, I don't know. And I'd gone to Britannia, and I was a half-decent kid in the school, although I got shaken up, luckily, by a professor, or at least a principal, who was really good. Buck Yo was his name. And he called me down when I was in grade 10 and said, "Hey, Bob, I've been watching you." And here I am, one of 600 students at Britannia. And he said, "You know, you've got quite a potential." And that was a shock to me. And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, we just don't think you realize it, that's all." And so he pushed me to get on with it. And as a result of that, I actually entered a poster competition, because I was in the art class, and ended up getting third prize for North America as a result of that. And it did kind of stir me up to realize that, yeah, there was something there. But at any rate, opening to City Hall was really a result of working for my dad, building his house. And it was fascinating because I worked in the sewer department. I was able to give speeches later saying, you know, I started below the bottom, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was at the sewer repair counter on the 5th floor at City Hall. And I watched the pattern of power in City Hall, this kid of 19 sitting in the corner. And it became clear that the city engineer was the big man in this building, and I was this kid in the corner watching him come up in his own private elevator to the 5th floor and realizing, okay. And then I asked myself, okay, we all jump for him. Who does he jump for? And I guess there was this political side to me right from the beginning. And I watched, and I waited, and I saw two corporations caused John Oliver, this 6'4" guy, to jump. One was the BC Electric Company, the big private streetcar company and power company. And the other was the CPR. And this kid sitting in the corner with probably socialist thoughts said, aha, that's the way the game is played. And so it was great, a great spot to begin and begin to understand the nature of the power structure. But it was, what more can I say other than, I guess there was a new planner in City Hall in those days, the first time we had a planner. He was an Englishman. His name was Gerald Sutton Brown. And he held a kind of colonial view of his role and certainly his past. And one particular vacation, I actually was in Jamaica and stayed near where he apparently grew up. And it was in Jamaica where I had wanted to meet one of their early leaders and did so. But at the same time, I happened to mention the Sutton Brown name to the woman who ran this particular B&B and trained young local girls in commerce. And so I mentioned this name, and she said, "What? That SOB?" And I said, "What?" Well, she said, "I collect money from the big hotels down here in Ocho Rios, and I never get anything from Sutton Brown. I never get anything." And I thought, aha. But as it turned out, my friend Charles Barber is doing a new opera here in town in the next few months on Chinatown and slum clearance in Chinatown. And so it made me reflect on Sutton Brown again and the nature of all that. When I ran for city council way back then, I ran against slum clearance. I ran against the kind of treatment that local Chinese Canadians were getting. We were clearing out individual houses in Strathcona and paying the individual owners $15,000 for their home. It was their whole lifestyle, their whole community, their whole history. And I ran for council against that, and Sutton Brown, who I really had an edge on in terms of trying to deal with them in some ways on behalf of the whole community. As a result of that, and others that were working in the neighborhood, we were ending up able to grapple with that and clean it up. And Charles' new opera is going to celebrate that in the next few months in a wonderfully gracious piece of work that involves countless Chinese Canadians. But I hadn't intended to say any of this, so it's time for you to ask me better questions.
Thanks, Bob. I also want to just recognize Benjamin Isset and Thomas Bevan, who are here today, who also helped with this book with Bob. And I'm wondering if we can just begin, Bob, if you could just share where the writing project began. When did you decide to write a memoir? You have a whole lot of stories and probably a couple more books left in you, but where did the project start?
Oh, Lord. I've been lucky enough to have a winter place in Arizona and in Phoenix. And as a city planner, I guess Phoenix isn't regarded as a great, beautiful place. I actually like it quite a bit because it's so contrary in countless ways, and it's a classic American city as well. So I just found my memory really taking place, and to a great extent, I grew up on Wall Street in the East End, and got used to all those freight cars down below. And so my memory was actually operating like those shunting freight cars. And I was getting up at 4 in the morning because my memory was requiring me to. And then the old brain would trundle stuff out just automatically, really. And I'd make hand notes, of course. And then the other side of the brain, the more analytical side, ended up analyzing what had tumbled out. And so it was that period in the desert that got me going. But then disrupted me again and again. But then at later stages, Ben over here talked me into picking up that work, and subsequently Thomas did as well. And I'm blessed to have lived long enough to have completed that work, and I'm overjoyed that Silas and the White family have agreed to publish it, and here we are today. So but it's been an erratic game.
When I first read it, Bob, you come from the generation before the baby boom generation, and reading about Vancouver in the 40s, 50s, 60s, it was really illuminating for me to get that window into the city. But wondering if you can speak a little bit to you growing up in East Vancouver in the
Sure.
30s and 40s.
Yeah, well, I guess I ended up being thankful to my grandmother, Nana, for helping me escape from looking after my siblings, who were all younger. And I had grown up in North Burnaby and the East Side, looking after the fire, lighting the stove in the mornings, and cooking porridge and cutting kindling and all of that stuff through the 30s and 40s. And my Nana she was one of many squatters. In those days, squatters in the city were just common. And so the whole waterfront through the East Side and Cole Harbor and Falls Creek and so on, it's just full of float houses. I've got a love for float houses. And they, at any rate, Nana had a cabin on Roche Point or Dollarton on the North Shore, and her own home was in North Burnaby. And so she liked to have me come and spend time with her at camp up in the North Shore. And so I was a 10-year-old, and we would take the streetcar up through North Burnaby and hike over Capitol Hill and down to where she kept her rowboat down at the base of Capitol Hill. And I would row Nana across the Chuck as a 10-year-old and helped settle her in the cabin, which was a pretty good cabin. As the photographs here, well, that's not quite it, but that'll do. And wait for her boyfriend to arrive from his job as a street railwayman. But the East Side was, you know, a really deep home, and I try and describe some feelings about the East Side in the book, and memories of wonderful people and dear friends, and the tough capacity of all those women. You know, some friends of mine from those days will remember the elderly woman who used to sit behind whoever was chairing our constituency meetings. And there she was knitting away and didn't make a lot of noise during those meetings in the East Side. But in earlier times, Tom Berger was sort of a potentially active politician in those days. And so they came nosing around the Rio Hall up on Kingsway and Joyce. And, but the woman in the back who was knitting listened to these people, and then so the issue of Tom Berger coming and replacing our longtime MLA came up, and without dropping a stitch, she said, "Nope." And that was how the decision was made back then. But so the dedication to the strong women is well meant, and especially for my wife. So, but Britannia was a particularly great school in those days, and even now, and I'm overjoyed to see that the local school district has agreed to maintain it. And part of the reason for doing that is because the Indigenous population around Brit is so substantial, and they've done a lot to work with Indigenous people in the neighborhood and wanted to grow that and build it. And so that, anyway, Commercial Drive was a great street that we all wandered in lunch hour and totally enjoyed. But
now, Bob, you could have ended up going in a totally apolitical direction in your life if it wasn't your friend Mary, who's in the audience here. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your when John Diefenbaker became Prime Minister,
of course,
and how
sure.
you ended up starting to get politically engaged.
Well, sure. I guess I always was political, but given my history with my grandfather and my mother and so many others, but Mary Robson was a student with me in the planning school and postgraduate studies at UBC, and I had gone out with my dad actually to listen to John Diefenbaker. He was doing the big journey across Canada, and the issue was Follow John. And so I showed up at the PNE, the Gardens, to listen to his speech, and I was not impressed, and I thought he was a demagogue, and I don't think Mary felt that way at all. She felt he was an independent red Tory from the prairies, and it was maybe with roots not all that different in many ways. But I was complaining at school, saying, oh, that guy, I just heard him, and blah, 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 blah. And Mary said, well, you know, if you feel that strongly, you better do something about it. And I said, yeah, I guess you're right. So I went down to the Tellier building down here in the downtown east side. And the CCF offices were up there on the 6th floor or something like that, a rattly elevator going up. So I did, and as a result, I became very active in the riding, and a terror and a pain in the ass for countless people. But it was thanks to Mary that I got moving, and we've been deep friends ever since.
Bob, when you were on Vancouver City Council, it's hard to, it's not that long ago in a way, in the 60s, but at that time, in order to run for City Council, you actually had to own property. And wondering if you can speak a little bit to your work on council.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'm offended by the idea that property should be a requirement to be a citizen, in effect. And so that bothered me quite a bit, and I thought, can I pull off a caper here on City Council, even though I'm only one? And so I started working on each of the councillors quietly, one by one. And the one that I ended up enjoying working with the most was an old city family, the Bell Irving family. It was Aeneas Bell Irving that I spent time with, and his son, I think, is still around. And but I said, Aeneas, you know, and in those days they didn't have strata apartments. And so many of the seniors that were well-to-do simply ended up moving into an apartment, and then they wouldn't be allowed to run for city council if they didn't own any other property. So I convinced Aeneas, and then Phil Lipp, and then some others, and gradually I thought, my God, I think I've got a majority. So when it came to the actual vote, the most active and more able councillors was Earl Adams, who was still a right-winger. And when it came time for the vote, and I got Aeneas on the list, and he was the last necessary vote for a majority, Earl said, what, that dumb, da-da-da-da-da. And we pulled it off, and so we were able to go to Victoria and get the city charter changed. As a result, tenants have been able to run for public office in this city ever since. So that's, Lord, 60 years ago. But thanks for asking.
And of course, you were one of the important senior cabinet ministers during the first NDP government in the early 70s with your friend Dave Barrett. I read Rod Mickleborough and Jeff Meggs's book on after getting elected, heading to the only seafood restaurant, where you're writing out the potential cabinet on the back of an envelope. Can you take us back to those heady days when it's like, oh, fuck, we got elected?
Well, and it wasn't that much of a surprise. We could sense the the shift that was coming, which was enormous, really, given the history of this province. Dave, we talked the night before, but he phoned at 10 in the morning and said, hey, we've got to get together and decide what we're going to do. And so I said, yeah, by all means. I've been sketching a few things out, and I had a big brown envelope and sort of wrote all around and inside and out, and thought, well, this will do. And Dave arrived at the back porch on Wall Street on the east side, and it's a long, spindly staircase, and we got together, and he said, let's go to the Only. When I was getting a treat from my dad, he would take me on my birthdays down to the Only near Carroll and Hastings. And I said, well, great. And we headed down there, and in those days, drugs weren't such a problem in the core of the downtown east side. And it was mainly drunks that were waking up at, 11:45 in the late morning. And as we were walking along, Dave's identity was so powerful and wonderful that, old boys in the little crannies would sort of be waking up and say, hey, Davey, good for you. And it was those kinds of times. And we ended up at the Only and being in the back corner and going over all the brown envelope material and Dave agreeing with 90% of the proposals, and that was sort of that. That was the transition program for a socialist government in British Columbia. But subsequently, I was in charge of the transition for Mike Harcourt. And that was a 2-week exercise with dozens of people and all the rest of it under the waterfalls at Robson Square, which I had commissioned with Arthur Erickson, and I paid for that. I said to Arthur, my God, you're famous for your leaky roofs, and here I am under them for 2 bloody weeks. But anyway, it was a great experience, but at the same time, it was slightly sloppy, and we'd forgotten to allocate BC Hydro to anybody. And BC Hydro, okay. And so one bright reporter said, hey, Dave, what about BC Hydro? Who's doing hydro? And he grabbed the ball, as he often did, and said, well, it's Williams. That's water resources. What's wrong with you? Don't you understand? So it was the way that many things, not many things, got handled. But yeah, it was great fun. But Dave was a joyous person. The whole group was joyous. There was that sense of real joie de vivre, and it made it all so worthwhile. I mean, it could have been a terrible burden, this burden of governing this complicated province, but it was anything but. It was a real joy to work with a group that was not jealous and had its own views, and I guess the incredible difference in terms of that government and most governments is that there was an independence amongst the many players, and somehow we were able to accommodate it. It was a really extraordinary group to work within, and as a result, and I guess I had big elbows, and I wanted to do a lot of work, but never did I really run into a lot of trouble with these elbows, surprisingly. So, and that's the way it was with most of us. It was a pleasure and a joy to work those years and report out to my buddies on the east side about it all.
When we think about the accomplishments of that government, the Agricultural Land Reserve gets mentioned, ICBC and others, but I'm wondering if you can speak to what you remember the most fondly in terms of the accomplishments of that period of that government.
Oh, wow. Well, I like to say that one of the accomplishments I really like, and this is not that period at all, but when I was an alderman, I realized that the east side was not getting any trees. We weren't planting boulevard trees on the east side. And in those days, Little Mountain was bald. You know, it had been a military camp. And I was up on the top of the mountain looking east and west. And I thought, for God's sake, we're discriminated even for bloody trees on the east side. And, you know, so I had a Red Tory friend, Tom MacDonald, who headed up the Community Planning Association of Canada here. And I said, Tom, I realized how few trees there are on the east side. And I said, you know, what's the explanation? He said, well, you know, the city used to be 3 municipalities, Point Grey, South Vancouver, and the east side, and the city of Vancouver, which went up to 16th Avenue back then. And he said, but Joe, Point Grey had a socialist leader who headed up their planning commission. He was the first planning commissioner for Point Grey. And he developed a tree planting program for Point Grey. And that's why the west side of the city still is this grandly treed part of the Point Grey Peninsula. And I said, oh my God. And he said, and that person was the first arborist for UBC, for the university. And he planted the boulevard trees on University Avenue and so on, and Chancellor Boulevard. And so I hadn't realized that. And I thought, okay, how do I get this done long term without just having a BS fight up at City Hall? And that Stuart Lafoe was the head of the Parks Board back then and very powerful, and lived in a mansion in Stanley Park, as it turned out as well, on Lagoon Drive. And so I went down and saw him one-on-one. And I said, look, I've been a bit of a troublemaker up at City Hall, if you haven't noticed. And I don't want to be a troublemaker unless I have to be. And so I'm bothered about the lack of street trees on the east side. And he said, oh, well, you know, the streets are so, they're rubble out there and there's no curbs and there's this reason. And I said, no, you're not going to convince me. I'm a city planner and I understand this stuff. So I said, I'd like you to start planting on a street that I know is a natural to be planted. He said, okay, what one is it? I said, it's Charles Street on the east side between Nanaimo and Renfrew. And it's 100-foot right-of-way, so there's no reason for not planting trees here. So I have to admit that other than them complicated the traffic pattern there terribly, and unnecessarily in my view, it's all, you know, these glorious 50-odd-year-old dogwoods. And for me, one of the joys of my work in politics was simply planting those damn trees on the east side. And they continue to roll out. So you just, you know, it's just one of the pleasures. But the other stuff, God, there is no end to it in terms of the ability of Norman Levy and his sense of justice, and his work with the John Howard Society people that worked with him in elections and so on. There was all kinds of things where this sense of justice being righted was part of everything we did. And in my case, because I was this nerdy planner, we ended up doing the most complicated integrated resource management stuff in Canada. And it's, you know, well, there's really no limit to what we weren't ready to turn over. But I think that's why I use the term using power well. We really because of Barrett's wonderful, free and easy style, we ended up often being dismissed and not being recognized the kind of depth of analysis that actually took place in terms of all the projects. I mean, the stuff we did on the ALR with my old colleagues Alistair Crerar and Mary Robson and others was extraordinary, in-depth work that was simply able to be done because of the nature of the Canada Land Inventory at the time. And we were able to implement the most sophisticated system out of the ALR, and nobody had anticipated that at all. So there was frequently that kind of in-depth, nerdy stuff that went on, but also with a kind of social conscience that ran very deep.
Bob, one of the other places you're very connected with in terms of your contribution is Vancity Credit Union. Wondering if you can speak to how you joined the board and kind of your work. There's a number of people in the audience from Vancity, including your relationship with the University of Bologna.
Wow, yeah. Well, I was almost 30 years, I guess, at Vancity or something like that. And it was a wonderful team. Some the people from Vancity are here tonight, staff and board members. And it was a shocker I was the first on the left to get elected. And in those days, they met up at the tennis court, Vancouver Tennis Club near 16th and Granville. And they just had a dinner once a week, once a month, I'm sorry to say, and with very little reporting out to the board. And that was the beginning of the 80s, and the real estate market in this region was falling apart. And hard to believe, but it did happen. But I ended up interviewing several developers who were in financial trouble and were attacking one another. So I ended up getting as full a picture of the nature of the decline in real estate in the town of anybody. So I would show up at meetings, at these dinner parties, and say, well, what about this stuff here? You've loaned this stuff out in Ladner, and that's a swamp out there, and you've done this and that. And as a result, we were perilously close to being bankrupt when I walked in the door. So much so, and I didn't realize that they brought in the best lawyers in town to monitor me at all those dinner meetings. And because I was able to get the detailed information on the differences between these realtors, I was able to just blow up stuff on a regular basis. But we were perilously close to bankruptcy, and board members realized we had to let the CEO go, and as a result, we did. But on the last meeting before he left, he had ended up making a loan that was 125% of value on the Fairview slopes. So you can't loan 25% more than the value of the property and stay in business. So I raised that at that meeting where we let that CEO go. And he complained that there wasn't one meeting he'd been at where he wasn't castigated. And that's the way it was. But then we turned it around, and it's become financially immensely successful, and we've had some excellent senior staff, and it was a learning experience for us all. And I was frequently a son of a bitch on business planning exercises, but we all survived it, and it's now a wonderful player in Western Canada.
Now, Bob, another institution.
But we also went to Bologna and discovered cooperative economics, and one of the most fascinating regions in the world of Emilia-Romagna and the University of Bologna. And incredibly able people. I don't think Vancity is pursuing it now to the extent that we did, And I'm very sorry about that, and I hope to meet with some of them in the near future and try and see if some of that can be knit together, because the cooperative world of Emilia-Romagna is one of the most successful economic activities underway anywhere in the world.
Now, Bob, while you were doing all of this, you were busy with other things as well. You and your family owned the Railway Club in its heyday from the early 80s to around 2005, 2008. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what got you into the bar business, and if you got any stories to share about the Railway Club in its heyday.
We started out first with a pub in Port Moody, and then after selling that, saw that the Railway Club was available, and we acquired it, and it made sense for our kids to work there as well. As it turned out, our eldest daughter, Janet, was just a natural business person and a pro in terms of managing music. She managed Spirit of the West, a great band from town here, for a decade, and she introduced Katie Lang to this part of the world and the bigger world, and that was, in many ways we did it just for the hell of it, to be truthful, and we did other stuff in government just for the hell of it too. So, the Princess Marguerite, rehabilitating this wonderful old CPR steamship, was a great exercise. And the truth is, we did it for the hell of it. We simply did it for the hell of it. And it was great fun, and it was a good success. And we did wonderful things like, a free ride for all the senior citizens of Victoria. And we happen to still own Greater Victoria in terms of our ridings that we've elected people in. So, there was the Railway Club was a wonderful 30-year experience that was joyous, really.
Now, Bob, in the book as well, you come out in it. This might be something that a lot of people don't know about, but also it was a factor in you leaving politics, as you describe in the book. I'm wondering if you can share that story.
Yeah, the nature of the times were such that it wasn't acceptable, and it was complicated in the sense that I was married and a family, and we all loved each other and continue to, and it was just necessary to make that decision and live another separate life. I'm sorry about some aspects of it, of course, but not others. And the times have changed so dramatically that it's simply the way it is, and it's part of my life now.
And in terms of politics, you tell this story in the book about it being raised with you and it being one of the factors in not running again.
Yes. Well, that's right. But I guess I was also finding that I was enjoying being a kind of a pro and to carry out the analysis and planning for the next government. And so we did that. Mike Harcourt was generous, and so I was doing a lot of the thinking and planning for his government up on Hornby Island, which was quite a photograph in there, I think.
In your role as chair of ICBC, you were instrumental in buying the mall that eventually, after Tech University, became SFU Surrey, working with Bing Tom. Wondering if you can share that story.
Yeah, I've always felt that Surrey was not treated adequately in the region, And Victoria really didn't have the know-how in terms of understanding that we're a dual region. Historically, we've been New West in Vancouver, and now it's Surrey in Vancouver. And there's been a terrible problem of the civil service based in Victoria doesn't really get the measure of the Lower Mainland very well. And so, but I'd been, ICBC was established by Bob Strachan, who had been our leader. And he said, I want to talk to you about this, Bob, when I was a young MLA. And I said, sure, I get it. It makes sense. It fits in with the car, the whole car process. But he said, no. He said, I want you to understand it's the capital. It's having the capital in the province, and you can use the capital and recycle it because it's spread out over such a long period of time. I said, oh, wow, that's a double, triple reason for having a public car insurance company. He said, yeah. So when Andrew Pitter was generous enough to appoint me as chair of ICBC, the first thing I wanted to do was see what we might do. And I was convinced as a planner that we had to establish Surrey City Centre as a substantial centre across the river. And we saw it as a wonderful real estate opportunity. So Gordon Smith, I don't know if Gordon's made it here tonight, but at any rate, bravo, Gordon. It was a joy to work with, just a simple joy to work with. And we pulled off a caper there that was extraordinary. I mean, had we been allowed to put it into full flower, the billions we would have made is extraordinary. So there's that kind of issue out there now for this government and any government to use their brains in terms of the potential money to be made on infrastructure by not giving it all away. In the case of Surrey, the next government, of course, gave most of it away. So most of us as citizens don't realize how huge these numbers are. And so it's a kind of Henry George economy that is the economy that I pursued often when I had the chance. And Surrey has been the beneficiary of it to a huge extent, and could be again. There's still places like, I look at White Rock right now as an old planner, and I look at that glorious bay, Boundary Bay, and how constricted that street is, and I say to myself, imagine one more block out of that bay and creating the grandest waterfront in this whole Lower Mainland, right there. Imagine what you could achieve doing that. And my colleague, Thomas Bevan, who's been so helpful on many things, argues, no, I don't think so, but I do. White Rock could be the most exciting city center for the southern half of the region. But enough.
Bob, my last question before we go to the audience for a few questions and the reception afterwards and book signing. You're 89 years old right now. What are you going to do in the second half of your life?
Well, you really want me to open up? No, it was dangerous. I was just almost doing so. But it's been a wonderful journey and with wonderful people and wonderful opportunities.
Great. We're going to open up to a few questions. There's going to be a few mics coming around shortly, but we have 5 or 10 minutes, so we can certainly get to 3 or 4 questions if people have them for Bob.
Bob, there's a picture of you in the slideshow. Looks like you're in your early 20s.
Where I'm what?
Looks like you're in your early 20s.
Yes.
You're powering a motorboat. Looks like an Okanagan lake you're on. I presume you're bronzed. You're a BC golden boy circa 1955. Yeah. Does that British Columbia still exist?
Oh, does that British Columbia still interest me?
Could there be someone today experiencing that?
Oh, look, the regions I was so lucky to have worked in the Okanagan and the Kootenays in those years when I was 19 or 20, actually. And I fell in love with the Kootenays, the West Kootenays in particular. And as a result of that, my old professor, Jim Wilson, worked for BC Hydro and compensated the people who were flooded on the Arrow Lakes. And he said to me, if you can ever do something more, Bob, it has to be done, because just giving them compensation for throwing them off their property isn't much of an answer. So I took that seriously, and he wrote a little book called People in the Way. And they were people I knew from the Monashee, like Suzanne Simard, who's a brilliant ecologist now who's turning the world upside down and figuring out what we should be doing in forestry. So I came to the conclusion that we needed to do something for the Columbia Basin. And we started holding quiet meetings and public meetings, and then finally with the MLA from Nelson Creston, Corky Evans, and other wonderful civil servants, we created the Columbia Basin Trust. And it is a profound review of what this province is about. There's probably, 6 or 7 macro regions in this province. The next one, I think, is Vancouver Island. And if this government is really swift, they'll create a macro region of Vancouver Island. Because the idea of wallpaper for this province, when the regions are so substantially different, is terribly inadequate. So begin by rethinking the macro regions. The island is a natural sub-region of this province. It could govern itself, in truth. And so the problem of working with the Indigenous people on that sub-regional basis looks to me to be manageable. But working with the Indigenous people province-wide doesn't strike me as manageable readily, anyway. And so we could be beginning to chip off these regions that are very real and so different. I mean, BC, with these 6 or 7 macro regions, is, I think, unique in Canada. Unique in Canada. We need to be more and more like Switzerland. We have to see these macro regions and give them more freedom and individuality and create the possibilities of this grand province. So, yeah, there we are. Good timing.
But Bob, there's a generational question.
Yes.
When you look at young people today, do they have the opportunity that young man had?
Oh, wow. Yeah, there's no question I was lucky. I think the squeeze in the city may just push young people out, and they put pressure on it. I don't think we've been swift enough to take the next step after the Columbia Basin Trust. We'll see. I'll give it another whirl, but I'm not sure. But the grandeur of British Columbia will never be fully realized until we capture those different regions and give them greater freedom.
We'll just take 2 quick questions or comments before we go over to the receptions. Are there any other questions or comments right there?
Bob?
Yes.
I'm sitting beside my son, Brennan, who's SFU, 4th year student, I don't know, somewhere in the middle. My question to you, in bringing up the younger generation, my question to you is, what is the torch that you would like to pass to any of us to pick up and bring more of your visions to life? If there's one torch, what's the torch you'd like to pass?
I think it is to capture the grandeur of the province. And I don't think we can do that given the present structure. that we have to have these macro regions and with greater freedom along with Indigenous people to create the nature of the new society.
So we have time for one last comment or question.
Virginia.
Oh.
I didn't put my hand up, but
Okay.
First of all, that's a fascinating torch. I mean, there's one thing about Bob Williams, there are no small questions, right? Like, let's just go home and sleep on that question or that torch. Bob, you and I have known each other for a few decades and always around Vancity. And you made such a huge impact at the credit union and well beyond. Do you have, how has your thinking evolved around, or has it changed at all around the power of financial institutions? Do you have any sort of words of wisdom as you think about what was collectively accomplished at Vancity and what we might try and get some more of in this place?
Yeah, I guess as a result of the work in Emilia-Romagna, I came to the conclusion that cooperatives were a terribly important answer in terms of how we design things. And so that became a dominant feature in my later years at Vancity and celebrating Emilia-Romagna. And in truth, I think they've taken it a step further by creating a social market. It's quite an advanced social approach to how we solve social problems. And I don't think Vancity has carried on with that work in Emilia-Romagna to the extent they could or should. And I'd like to pursue that further with some of their senior people, because it struck me that as we transformed the old police station into something that was more creative socially, it could be the route toward a new approach at the provincial government level in terms of social services, that we need to break this up in a more creative way. That still remains to be done. So I think that's a big one on the list, Virginia.
Great. Bob, I wanted to thank you so much for putting this book out into the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Bob will be signing books in the World Arts Center. We have some food and beverages available, so please join us. You can just go right through the doors right there, and see you shortly.